In the early 20th century, the population of the former Mexican province of Alta California increased dramatically. The Mexican-American population of the state increased during and after the Mexican Revolution. Between 1910 and 1930, California's Mexican-American populations grew from about 50,000 to over 350,000. During these same years, public policies in finance, housing, and education created new conditions, new connections between race, the uneven geographic distribution of wealth, and the school funding disparities that persist to the present time. In the early decades of the 20th century, public finance reformers dissolved California's statewide property tax. Before 1910, the statewide property tax was designed to tax both tangible and intangible forms of wealth owned by both individuals and entities like banks and corporations. This statewide tax was replaced with a local ad valorem tax on real estate after 1910 as part of the separation of sources reform designed to replace the general property tax with new taxing instruments that would increase the taxation of tangible forms of wealth. With this shift in public finance policies in the state, school districts in California increasingly turned towards district-level property taxes to generate revenue. At the same time that local property taxation supplanted California's statewide property tax, Mexican-American children attended California public schools were increasing and segregated by lawmakers, prompting Wallenberg to conclude that the Mexican-American children were by far the most segregated group in California public education by the end of the 1920s, something that we still see to this day. The growth of segregation for California's Mexican-American population during the 20th century was the direct result of a dense network of racist housing policies. One way policymakers manufactured residential segregation was through land use regulations like zoning. During the early 20th century, policymakers in California were among the first in the nation to use zoning policies to segregate space by excluding racialized groups. In 1917, the United States Supreme Court struck down explicit racial zoning plans, but policymakers across the nation continued to use public policies to segregate space through zoning ordinances that were facially race neutral, but in practice promoted segregated housing patterns. Even more directly, state and federal authorities and the Corrigan v. Buckley 1926 Supreme Court decision permitted the use of racially restricted convenience to enable segregation. Racially restricted convenience were written into the deed of a property. They stipulated that the property could never be sold or rented to a particular racial group. These conveniences often prevented Mexicans and Mexican Americans from purchasing or renting properties. Torres Roof points out that Mexican Americans were excluded from neighborhoods in LA, Orange, and Riverside counties. It was not until 1948 that the Supreme Court banned racially restricted convenience, though even then attempts to enforce racial convenience continued until 1953. Starting in the 1930s, federal policies helped further engineer the segregation of Mexican Californians. Federal housing policies were particularly influential. During the New Deal, the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation was created. HOLC provided low-interest mortgages to homeowners in neighborhoods that government officials did not consider hazardous. Hazardous neighborhoods were shaded red in the maps produced by HOLC. When rating neighborhoods and the presence of residents of color in a neighborhood prompted those same officials to classify a neighborhood as red and thus redlining it. Racially biased lending policies for borrowers of color, regardless of where they would purchase a property, racist real estate practices, and the perpetuation of violence against families who tried to move into white neighborhoods have been documented well. In combination with other federal housing, transportation, and federal assistance programs, suburban homeownership for white Americans was enabled and subsidized by the American government. While people of color were denied access to these same federal subsidies.